Hey there, everybody. It's Philip back here again with another video for the Trauma Lifeline. This afternoon, what I want to do is I want to really introduce you to the channel. If you saw my first video was an introduction to my friend, Jesus. And here's the reality, guys. I'm not here to talk about something I read in a book, although you're going to hear a lot of things I read in a book. And I'm not here to talk about a lot of things that I heard from somebody, although you're going to hear a lot of things I picked up from other people. The reality is, I have lived through some stuff, right? We all have. I went through a really tough childhood, and as a result of some of those experiences, I went on to spend 16 years in the foster care system. And some of those were tougher than the things that brought me into the system, to be honest with you. And so trauma is, it's not just something I read about, although I read about it a lot. I have worked with kids for the past 25 years in some capacity. I spent 20 years speaking to groups, but not like this, not about this. And about 6 years ago, I began to be impressed that I needed to go back and do something to support the kids that, like me, are coming through this foster care system, which is a terrible way to grow up. It's a terrible thing to go through, even though there are some wonderful people in that system that are working really hard to try to make it a little less terrible. And I appreciate all those people. But, for me, there's a scripture that says, he that knows to do good and doesn't do it, to him it is sin. And so it became really clear to me that I needed to be doing something to be interacting with those kids in some way. And so about 5 years ago, I stepped full time into working with foster kids. And I've been to a few different places now. I've worked in some residential treatment facilities. I've worked in some behavioral health facilities, and a couple places that were, treatment-based residential facilities. I currently work at a shelter. We work with kiddos that are currently in the foster care system. Some of them have just come into care. Others have, maybe had a failed placement, or, they've had to be hospitalized. They're coming out of that. They're trying to find their footing again. And the DHS workers are struggling to try to find placements for these kids because there aren't enough foster homes. Some of them have pretty severe behaviors because of the traumas they've been through and the bad habits they've learned along the way. And so, these things are really tough. And we get to work with those kids for a few weeks at a time, kind of right in the middle of this tornado, this hurricane of trauma that they're in the midst of. And so that's a very rewarding work. It's very challenging. It requires long days of very high diligence, and but I love it. But in the course of all that, not only what the Lord has showed me, because honestly, a lot of the things that we're learning about, that I'm being trained on as I work as a supervisor in this field, are things that, the Lord already took me through, right? And I'm so grateful for that, because the Lord has done so much in the way of healing me and healing my own hurts and my own traumas, things that, honestly, it would have taken a lot longer for me to develop trust to let a human being help me with those things, because I just wasn't there, And so recently, one of the developments in my walk with the Lord and his calling on my life to help kids and families has been I've been more and more burdened to help families and those that are caring for these kids. In my job, I get to work as a team lead, leading a team of youth care workers as they interact with these kids on a daily basis. So I get to coach them up. And then when the kids are in severe crisis, then I get to come in and I get to be there with them and kind of coach them through those experiences and help them out. And there are things about that I really, really like. But the Lord has really been burdening me more and more to work with families and to talk with families about the struggle and about some practical things that can help them. I think some of the time, some of the issues we have, kids wind up in care because families didn't know what to do. Sometimes because parents didn't know how to deal with their own trauma. They didn't understand maybe that the things they're struggling with are trauma. And then, a lot of kids are adopted and those adoptions fail because no matter how much training you go through, when it's at your house and it's happening at 12 a.m. in the morning, and you're exhausted and you're at the end of your rope, it's easy to overlook the things that are trauma. It's easy to miss out on the things that our kids are going through, and it's easy not to recognize that this is a trauma response that they're having, and they need us to be there for them. And they need to be reminded that, guys, your kid's behavior is not personal. It never was, and it seldom ever will be, right? And so those are some of the things we're going to talk about. One of the things that I have on my list of things to do today in this video, we're introducing the Trauma Lifeline. We're introducing the channel and kind of telling you what we want to be able to do. Well, one of the things I want to be able to do is talk in a real candid way, down-to-earth way, about the issue of trauma and about practical ways to deal with kids and loved ones that are in the midst of trauma. Most of the stuff you're going to hear from me is geared towards kids because that's where my experience is. That's where I live, so to speak. But if you have a loved one that maybe has returned from combat, that maybe has PTSD, I have a feeling that you're going to see some real strong connections between what we're saying about trauma kids and what you're seeing in that man or woman, that hero that that's come back from combat, that's dealt with some really tough things there. And so hopefully the goal is that, excuse me, that through all this, we'll be able to strengthen families and to help you better care for those loved ones that you're taking care of. So one of the things that's on my list I need to do is I need to give you a clear definition of trauma. What are we talking about when we talk about trauma? First of all, trauma is what happens when the body and the mind are overwhelmed by a negative experience, and the brain is unable to process that experience. It's unable to process the memory of that experience. It's unable to store that memory appropriately. So it's important to note trauma is relative. And what that means is something may be very traumatic for one person. Somebody else may have a very similar experience that doesn't seem to affect them at all. One of the key components to trauma is that trauma changes the way we see the world, right? So, for example, maybe take a car wreck, right? Somebody has a car wreck, and it may not even be that severe, but from that point forward, they have anxiety, or they have fear, or they have struggles with returning to a car or returning to getting behind the wheel of a car again. And so clearly that's a trauma. It's changed the way they see the world. It's changed the way they see driving a car. It's impacted their daily activities. So therefore, that meets the definition of a trauma. Maybe one of the things that could come out of that is that person realizes how helpless they felt in that moment. They couldn't do anything about it. And so that helpless feeling that they had may reemerge in the context of current events, right? And it'll be this really strong response, maybe coupled with fear, maybe coupled with anger, and it doesn't feel like it fits. And yet, you don't necessarily know that it fits with that car accident either, right? Because, and maybe it has to do with, after the car accident, maybe there's an injury or something that prevents them from being able to do what they normally do. And in that moment, they feel trapped. And that's the memory that's not stored. That's the memory. And see, what happens with trauma is that when memories aren't properly processed in the moment, they're not properly stored in the brain, the emotions, the sights, the sounds, the feelings that went along with that memory bleed through into the present, right? It's like that memory is overlaid over everything that happens. And the slightest little connection can bring a person back into the emotional state that they were in that trauma, or can bring them to have a physiological response that is connected to that trauma. And the thing is so you may not know that's happening. The victim of this, the person who suffered the trauma, may not even know, and they probably won't. If no one's ever explained it to them, they're going to have no idea that this is connected to that trauma, right? Many people, and I'll say this, especially boys and men, the safest emotion to feel is anger, right? You're not vulnerable when you're angry. And so what will happen is all of the big emotions that boys and men feel oftentimes gets channeled. It happens with girls too, but especially with boys and men, those emotions will be channeled as anger. And they don't know why they're angry. And they'll tell you, I don't know why I'm angry. I'm just angry. Okay. Well, chances are that's connected to something else, right? But they don't know that. So you have to be able to walk them through that in order to discover, okay, where is this coming from? And if you ask them where it's coming from, they're not going to know. They don't know because it's not a conscious thing that's happening. It's something that happens in the subconscious, right? But it's sort of semi-conscious because you can discover it. You can recognize it. And so what we want to work with here is I wanted to define trauma for you. Trauma is a negative experience that overwhelms the senses, and the brain is unable to process the experience or the memory of that event. And it changes the way the individual sees the world. That's what trauma is. And trauma is relative, so it's not the same. Two people can have very similar experiences. One of them is heavily traumatized by it, and the other one isn't. They seem to be fine. It doesn't seem to affect them at all. And that's something that's just how it works. You might look at someone else's experience that causes them great trauma and changes the way they see the world, and they have all these responses from that, and you look at that and you say, that doesn't seem like a very big deal, right? Or you see someone else on the other side, they've been through a whirlwind of stuff that blows your mind. You can't imagine anybody could ever survive that, and yet they seem to be fine. They don't have any trauma responses, right? It doesn't make sense. We can't quantify trauma. It doesn't work that way, right? So we have to watch the results. We have to watch the effect that it has on people. We can't predict what that effect will be. So we have to see it when it happens, and then we have to walk backwards and see what it's connected to, right? How do you know that a response or an action or behavior is a trauma response? Great question. I'm glad you asked. The way you know that is you ask yourself the question, is that response proportionate to what's happening? In other words, does it sort of fit with what's going on, or is it way too big for what's happening in the present? What often happens when we see kids that have a response that's way too big for what's happening. Maybe somebody brushed by them in line, right? And instead of saying, like, dude, can you give me some space? They like flip out and start screaming and yelling and why are you up in my bubble and why are you trying to hurt me? And maybe they have this blown out response to that, And what you're thinking is, what is wrong with you? That used to be the question we ask, right? And we're trying to reframe that now. We're trying to ask, instead of what is wrong with you, we would like people to ask, boy, what happened to you? Like what happened to you that is creating such a overwhelming response to something that's such a small stimulus? And so if we come at it with this, we got to come at this with compassion. And so we want to do that. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to recognize the effects, the impact of trauma in the moment, in the present. And so when we can do that, then we can see what there's going to be some things happening in the mind, there's going to be some things happening in the body, and there's going to be all these responses are coming together to form the trauma response, right? And so we're going to give you some practical steps to, first of all, we're going to try to reframe some of those triggers so that we can start to lessen the frequency of responses. We're going to teach you some tools to back up, to reverse some of the physiological effects. So when this person is escalated, they're struggling, they're angry, they're losing control of their faculties, right? Their ability to reason, because what happens is the brain, the part of the brain that does the thinking and processing and all that, is up here. And the part of the brain that's responsible for survival, back here. So what happens is when a person gets emotionally escalated, they go into a survival brain mode. So the front part of the brain, where all the processing is done, actually shuts itself off, gradually shuts itself off, and allocates those resources to the survival brain in the back. So what happens when that takes place is that individual, that child or that adult, their ability to reason with you is greatly diminished. So it's telling somebody, well, just calm down, not too effective, right? Because if they could calm down, they would. So what we want to work on is understanding what's happening, understand the physiological, the psychological effects that are taking place within that individual. Then we want to talk about how to walk those back. There are some techniques, there are some tools that I can give you to help you as a loved one or as an individual, as a survivor of trauma, to walk back the physiological response so that you can regain, the individual can regain control of themselves. And I like to frame it like this. Whatever happened to you was terrible. It was bad. It wasn't good. And, obviously, if you could go back in time and make it so that experience didn't happen, of course you would do it, right? It was bad the first time, but you made it through. Like, you survived. How much do you want that trauma experience to control you in the present? The experience, the thing happened in the past. How much control do you want to give that thing in the present? Now, most of my kids that I work with, when I ask them that question, they'll say, I don't want it to control me at all in the present. And that's the answer I'm looking for. And my response is, well, then let me help you. Let me help you take back your remote. Let me help you take back control of your body, of your mind, of your heart. Because the reality is, especially if it's abuse, guys, the abuser already hurt you once. They don't deserve to control you in the present. And so we want to give some real practical things to help you if you're the individual or if you're the coach, the loved one, the caretaker that's trying to help these kids to walk back that response and take back control. And so that's what I want to do with this channel. That's what I want to do with our time together. I want to share with you some practical things about how to take back control, about how to work through trauma, about how to process it. Now listen, a couple clarification things. I'm not a therapist. I am not a mental health professional at all. That's not my role. I am a survivor. And I've had the opportunity to work with some trauma kids. And so what I'm going to give you is just the practical stuff. There's nothing to be gained. I'm not doing any of that stuff. I don't have a degree. If you need therapy, which you probably do, I know I probably do, then you need to seek that from a licensed therapist, because I'm not one. Okay? So this is the Trauma Lifeline. And I thank you for stopping by, and keep your eye out for more videos. Thank you.